Welcome. As part of Sustainable Conservation's Check-in and Connect campaign, we've launched a new blog series to share even more stories about the people that make our progress possible. A significant part of our organization's story and success, this new series will feature our various board members, stakeholders, and thought leaders, and explore their passions and connection to Sustainable Conservation's mission and vision for positive environmental change in California. Our first collection of interviews will feature our board of directors, volunteers who work hard each year to bring people together in order to solve our state's biggest problems in relation to our state's land, air, and water. Our first conversation is with Dan Dooley. We are especially pleased to have him here as our new board chair. Dan Dooley has nearly 4 decades of experience in California agriculture, natural resources and water policy, and legal issues. In that time, Dan has developed a reputation for helping clients successfully bridge economic and environmental interests. Dan is a principal at New Current Water and Land, LLC, which provides strategic planning and services for water supply and water management projects, as well as agricultural investments in California. From 2008 through 2014, Dan served the University of California Office of the President, first as the Vice President of Agricultural and Natural Resources, and then as the Senior Vice President for External Relations. Dan has held C-level roles with the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the California Water Commission. He's also served on the National Academy of Sciences Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources, the Western Rural Development Center Board, and the Board of Trustees of Children's Hospital Central California, which he chaired. Early in his career, Dan was partner in the family-owned Dooley Farms as a San Joaquin Valley farming operation producing cotton, alfalfa, tomatoes, and walnuts, which continues operation under the next generation of family management. We're very pleased to have Dan here with us today for this conversation. Thank you for being here, Dan. Wonderful. Hello, Dan. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time.
My privilege, Michael.
Well, let's get started. I mean, looking back, and as people can see from the the years you've spent in this space, a question that we were dying to sort of ask you is, what do you love and want to truly protect in California for future generations?
Well, partly it stems from a way of life, right? We have an incredible environment in which we all live and work, and I think it's in everyone's interest, regardless of your occupation, that we take protection of that environment seriously. And from where I come from, a farming family in the San Joaquin Valley, the issues that have become gravest for us relate to both access to and quality of water to support our economic enterprises and the local communities, and air quality. And I can remember as a kid growing up halfway between the Sierra Nevadas and the coastal range on almost any day of the year, standing in one spot and being able to see the peaks on both ranges. That's a rare exception now, usually either preceding or following a big storm event. Although COVID-19 has dramatically reduced traffic, and it's noticeable in the improved quality of air. And then as a young professional, I had the opportunity, candidly, to get involved in particularly the water space and represented water users, but as I like to say, there's self-selection among lawyers and clients, and I was not the client for the people who wanted a flamethrower. I was the lawyer for clients who wanted to find some strategic landing place, some way to collaborate and achieve mutual objectives. And so that thrust me at least 1 foot in the conservation space and 1 foot in the water user space. And sort of made a career out of moving among those communities, and it's given me a floundering belief that you can work in both spaces and make the world a better place. And so that's that's why I'm here, Kevin.
Was there a defining moment, or we can go back to where you said you were able to sort of work in both of those spaces? Was there a defining moment in your life early on that sparked your passion for the environment?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it sounds hokey, but my wife and I are both from Hanford, California. We got married relatively young. I was 22, she was 21. I had law school to go to. After a couple of years bouncing around in unfulfilling jobs, she ended up as an analyst at the State Personnel Board and was there less than a year. And then incoming Governor Brown hired her to work in the Horseshoe on his personal staff, particularly working in legislative affairs and relations. And I, meantime, am going to law school, took the bar exam, and told my wife that I was going to play tennis and drink beer for 6 weeks before I started looking for a job. But on the Saturday after the bar exam, a colleague of hers in the governor's office held a little barbecue in his backyard here in Sacramento. And so I went, 48 hours from walking out of the bar exam, and wearing literally cut off jeans, flip-flops, and a white t-shirt. And I ended up standing in the hot dog line with then Secretary of the Agriculture and Services Agency, Rose Bird, who later became the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. And she said, "You're a farm kid, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, why don't you give my assistant a call next week and come in? I have something I want to talk to you about." Well, one thing led to another, and the next week I put a coat and tie on and went in and met with Rose, and she offered me a job. And the job was to conduct a major overhaul of the state pesticide regulatory program. I understand I'm 26 or 7 years old, thrust into a role that I had no earthly idea how to achieve it. But you roll up your sleeves and you get started, and had a very successful outcome. Got legislative approval of the structure we created, which still exists to this day. Well over 50 years later. And then I decided to go back to the farm, but Governor Brown called me up and said, "I'd like to appoint you to the California Water Commission." And he did. And I became the chair, and so, got involved in the water space and started applying these principles that I learned when I was working as the Undersecretary of Agriculture. And so I really think the seminal moment was when Rose Bird decided that sight unseen, I was worthy of hiring and giving me more responsibility than anybody my age should have had, not knowing what I didn't know and somehow making it all happen. And that created a sort of level of confidence, not so much in subject matter knowledge, but in analytical processes that I possessed that allowed me to take on complicated, difficult tasks and figure it out, and now I think that's all any of us who are successful do, is we figure it out. Anybody who tells you at the outset of undertaking a difficult project that they know how to get to the end point that's successful is probably not being straight with you. You get up in the morning, you go to work, you figure out, what do I need to do today? You do it the best you can, and then you wake up again the next morning and do it again. And part of it, I think, is recognizing that you do these things in increments, and as long as you're moving in the right direction, you're on the right path.
How did you first connect with sustainable conservation and our mission?
Actually, didn't directly connect with sustainable conservation, but in 2008, I went to work in the office of the president of the University of California. And there is a statutory position on the State Board of Food and Agriculture for a representative from the university. And traditionally, it was the vice president for Ag and Natural Resources, which was the role I had. So I was appointed to the state board of food and agriculture, and Ashley Boren was a member of the state board. And we rapidly discovered that we liked one another. We were interested in what one another thought. And so we developed, what I consider a friendship. And then I invited Ashley to serve on the president of the University of California's Commission on Ag and Natural Resources. My goal was to give a little more weight to the natural resources side of that name. There were a lot of farmers and and I was a charter member of the commission until I got a paycheck from the university. But Ashley agreed, came on board, and then a few months later, turnaround's fair play. She asked me if I'd serve on the advisory board of sustainable conservation. And then not too long after that, I lose track a little bit of the time, but I was invited onto the governing board. But once I got involved, it became apparent that this was a different organization, and really had its feet on solidly on common sense approaches, and had an uncommonly strong reputation in the agricultural community for a conservation organization. So as I mentioned at the outset, I've had this history of sort of walking among a variety of communities. It seems to me that the conservation organization that fits that model most closely is sustainable conservation. So it was the match made in heaven, I think.
Could you expand on that a little bit more in terms of what you think sets sustainable conservation apart from other organizations in the conservation space?
Sure. I have lots of friends and have a high regard for a number of organizations in the conservation community. But I think too many, even among those that I have a high regard for, start with a policy agenda and try to figure out how to push it down. And contrast to sustainable conservation that identifies a problem and then goes to work on the ground with collaborators and tries to figure out what's a reasonable and practical solution. And once they find that solution, then they figure out how do we scale it up. So they're never sustainable conservation is never imposing policy ideas on people on the ground. They're working with people on the ground to identify best practices that work to solve a problem, and then they figure out how to scale it up. And I think that is a unique characteristic among conservation organizations. Well, in fact, I would say it's a unique characteristic among a whole host of organizations that engage in the policy world. But particularly in the environmental community, I think that sets sustainable conservation apart.
Dan, as our new board chair, and thank you for your service. We of course appreciate you taking that on. What would you like your legacy to be in terms of, when you eventually leave the position of chair? What do you want to leave behind as your legacy?
Well, I do not embrace the term legacy. So that's, that can be a positive or a negative term. And I've sort of learned my lesson on that by talking to former Governor Brown, who bristles when anybody asks him what his legacy is. But I do think, would I view my term as chair to be successful if certain things happen? Yes. And so clearly, and you and I have spoken of this, clearly, we want to do everything we can to put the organization's financial future in a more secure place. And, we're confronted with some unique challenges in that regard, not of our making. But I still think it's possible, and part of that is bringing on good people, and that includes you. I think Ashley Boren has clearly found her sweet spot in terms of leading the organization, both financially and programmatically. I also would feel I had made some market success if I can do more to connect past leadership of the organization with current and future leadership of the organization. I think organizations that are highly successful are ones that have a keen sense of their history and understand how it forms their future. And so I've already begun to reach out to successful former chairs and board members and am asking for their input, counsel, and guidance. I've already begun thinking about a time when I'm not the chair, and how do we empower existing board members to be engaged and develop the understanding and sense of the organization to be successful as successor leaders of the organization. So that's a very high priority for me. And if I'm successful in achieving that, I will feel good about my tenure on the board. And then finally, I obviously have a keen interest in the subject matter of a lot of the organization's programmatic activities. And I think if those programs and activities continue to expand and lead to successful results, I will take some pride at a high level in helping the organization manage through achieving that success. I'm very mindful of the separation of oversight and governance as opposed to implementation of strategies and programs. But it's rare, candidly, where someone like me who is recognized in many circles as a subject matter expert has the opportunity to work with people who are on the ground, actually implementing programs and trying new ideas. So, I'll be mindful of the separation of responsibilities, but I intend to work as much as possible, as Ashley will let me, work with the program people to make sure we're thinking through things clearly, understanding who the players are that need to be influenced to rally around ideas that we think are successful and can be scaled up. So those three areas, I think, are areas that I think are high priorities and where some modicum of success will make me feel good about my tenure as the chair. And hopefully the organization will feel that as well.
If there were one thing you would want people to know about sustainable conservation, if there was, I guess if you had 15 seconds or something to that matter, if there's one important thing that people need to take away about the organization, how would you describe that?
Well, I've thought a lot about this question, and there are a variety of different ways to answer it. But I think I would want people to know we work from the ground up and not from from on high down. I would want people to know something I'm not sure they do know, the depth of the organization. There are incredibly talented people working for this organization, both as volunteers. Certainly our staff is, I think, second to none, and the collaborators that we have on the ground. You know, nobody can rival that mix of things, in my view. So, but it's depth, you know, depth in a variety of ways, but certainly depth of knowledge, depth of staff, depth of collaborators and supporters.
What advice would you give Californians who want to get more involved with climate change issues?
You know, as I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 has sort of given us a glimpse of what could be, you know, in terms of our own impact on the environment, with less human activity going on, particularly in greenhouse gas emissions. We can see clear evidence of what changed behavior could result in. I was on a Zoom cocktail party with a former colleague who lives in Redlands last night, and he told me it's absolutely incredible, the view of the mountains that he hasn't seen in years, just because there's so much less traffic. So I think you can point to existing conditions, albeit not arrived at in the most reasonable manner, and say, this is what's possible, right? And we can all do more. In my own business, we just had a conversation this morning about this. We've realized we don't need to be jumping in a vehicle and driving to an in-person meeting somewhere every time somebody wants to talk to us. We do just fine with Zoom. And we're all, you know, on the tail end of our careers. We're used to doing things the way we do things, but we're also pretty smart people, and we figured out, you know, it's a lot less wear and tear on your body, and more efficient to get on a Zoom meeting and have your meeting and immediately go to the next one without ever getting out of your chair. So I think if things happen as I suspect they will, there's going to be a significant change in the way people do business that's going to have very positive implications for how we address climate change. And then the final thing, you know, for people on working lands, particularly in agriculture, some of whom are climate deniers, right? I remind them that the things you should be doing to address climate change, you should be doing anyway. They have independent utility. They either save you money, you apply fertilizers that are taken up by the plant in much higher percentages, you know, a whole host of things that you can do if you're a farmer that improve the efficiency of your operation. And oh, by the way, they have climate change benefits. So those are kind of a mix of things, I think, that I like to tell people about.
If there was one environmental problem in California you could change with a snap of your fingers, what would it be?
Well, I'm a water guy, right? So you're not going to be surprised, but I would fix the Delta and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. We have been trying to manage the water for flows and environment and the water for export through flows alone for decades. And you know, the ecosystem is continuing to decline. Fisheries are continuing to decline. We're moving less water than the demand is for. And partly it's because we've tried things and they didn't work, and for some reason we try them again. We need, in my view, we need to figure out how we improve the efficacy of the water we dedicate to the ecosystem, which undeniably means we've got to restore more tidal marsh habitat, which most of the fishery biologists will tell you is critical to enhancing the anadromous fisheries in particular. And we just got to do it. And the problem is we have generational thinking, right? And there are too many people my age and older, candidly, who are still fighting the same battles they were fighting in the 80s. And maybe someday they'll solve those problems, but the problems have changed, right? And we've got to skip over some generations, get some new people involved with fresh ideas and fresh thinking, and it ought to be our number one priority. And I've increasingly been wondering, notwithstanding my past opposition, if the sustainable conservation model and approach is really, maybe that's what's needed. We need somebody who has a reputation of solving problems by working on the ground and up to jump into this morass and try to help bring people along with some new thinking and new ideas. And maybe we'll find the solution. But that, in my view, for the future sustainability of California, figuring a way we can manage the Delta ecosystem and effectively and reliably convey water to where the people are is the most pressing issue. It's also politically the thorniest, right? So we have a situation where 2/3 of the water precipitation in California falls in the northern third of the state, and 50% of the people in the state live south of Wilshire Boulevard. And somehow we've got to get our arms around how to deal with that. And I'm not one who thinks we have to convey all of the water everybody always thought we needed. I think we've become incredibly more efficient in how we manage water, and less water, more than we're currently reliably transporting, but less than we thought we needed to move, will meet our needs for a long time into the future.
Clearly, these are challenging times in terms of the pandemic, as well as the social unrest that we're experiencing across the nation. What's it like to serve on a board and be working at the level of leadership that you are during these times?
I'm not sure it's much different because of those conditions. I will say I'm very proud of the staff and under Ashley's leadership with the commitment to diversity training and diversity and inclusion equity training. We have set up a structure, virtual training for board members in July, and I'm pleased to say 8 members of the board have signed up for that, which I think is a reflection of a sensitivity to some of the underlying causes of the social unrest now that are possessed on the board, and a willingness to sort of open for board members to open themselves up to maybe their own unrecognized thoughts and feelings about some of those issues in a way that will make us more sensitive as an organization, as a board, to the need to be sensitive to people of all persuasions, colors, and sexual orientations in the future. And recognize that everybody has value and brings different perspectives to a board like this, an organization like this, that only improves the quality of the decisions and programs undertaken by the organization. So in that sense, you know, I'm candidly very excited to be leading the board in engaging in those efforts.
Is there anything that we don't know that you feel we should, that we haven't chatted about, that you would like to talk about?
Well, I think on the substantive issues, we've certainly hit the highlights. I'm a father of daughters, and very proud of that. And they're both very successful, both keenly sensitive to environmental issues and love the outdoors and spend a lot of time out and about. Um, and we're, as a family, very close. And I will mention one final thing. My father passed away almost exactly a year ago at 93. He was nothing ever but a farmer in the San Joaquin Valley. Uh, People thought that he thought like every other farmer in the valley, which was certainly right of center, which was not true. I successfully negotiated a settlement to longstanding litigation to restore flows to the upper San Joaquin River and to restore a salmon fishery. And some of my farming neighbors gave me guff about it and said, I'm sure you've disappointed your father. And my comment was, nobody will be more happy to see salmon flowing in the upper San Joaquin River than my father. And the notion that farming and supporting environmental values are inconsistent, I think, is something I've never understood. And it's because, candidly, that's the way my family thought. And we worked hard on the farm. We did all the things other farmers did, but we also worked on environmental issues in the high Sierras and other places. And it was just a part of who we were. And so I don't see, candidly, where I've ended up to be abnormal. It was sort of predestined by the values that I was taught by my parents in particular, and more extended family generally. And so it's, I'm pretty proud of that. My mother's still living, and my wife is taking care of our 2-year-old granddaughter nearby, and my youngest daughter and son-in-law and granddaughter and my wife are taking my 93-year-old grandmother up into the high Sierras to a place that my mom and dad have had for many years. And they're all just thrilled about it. So, we have values that are rooted in natural systems and values that reflect a longstanding commitment to making sure our grandkids have a chance to do some of the things we did when we were younger.
Thank you, Dan.
You
We
bet.
really appreciate you sharing that.
Yep.
And we wish you all the best in the role as chair. And again, thank you for your service and your leadership.
Oh, thank you, Michael. And just for the record, you're doing a great job. I know it's only been a few months, but and a few difficult and trying months. But it's amazing to me how the organization's continuing to move forward even under these circumstances. And communicating with Ashley earlier this week, we have the San Joaquin Advisory, or the advisory board meetings coming up, I think next week, or maybe the week following. And we've got almost record attendance, I think. So people are adapting to the virtual meetings, and this way you don't have to fight to find a parking place in downtown Berkeley. So, yeah. Thank you, Michael.